Montana Territory, 1879. The wind cut sharp across the open plains near Deer Lodge, brushing through brittle grass and tugging at the hem of Violet Norrin's worn calico dress as she stepped off the supply wagon. Her fingers clenched the leather strap of her satchel, knuckles white, heart pounding harder with each bootstep from the townsfolk echoing around her. She had come back. After 5 years away, years spent hiding in the folds of her aunt's Kansas homestead, Violet had returned to the place that had once broken her heart in slow, cruel pieces. She was 22 now, not 17. Not the trembling girl who had stood on the church steps while the schoolboys laughed at her trying to read aloud. Not the girl who had fled after the last cruel whisper chased her home. But as the blacksmith's son passed her by and scoffed, "Still can't spit out a sentence, huh, Violet?" Her throat tightened all the same. She ducked her head and kept walking. She had a job here now. Miss Elspeth, the widowed schoolteacher, had written her about needing help with the younger children. Violet had always been good with kids. They listened with patience. They did not laugh when you took your time to speak. The schoolhouse stood a mile past the edge of town, a squat white building with a sagging roof and a bell that had not worked in years. Miss Elspeth greeted her kindly, gave her a cot in the back room, and handed her a stack of readers to sort. Violet spent that evening sitting by the stove, tracing the worn spines with her fingertips, whispering the words aloud to herself, slow and careful. She had not noticed the rider until the door creaked open. He was tall, dust-covered, and broad across the shoulders, with a rifle strapped to his saddle and tired eyes under the brim of his hat. He stepped inside and pushed his hat back with 2 fingers. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "I was told Miss Elspeth keeps a few bandages here." Took a nail through my palm fencing cattle. Miss Elspeth nodded toward the cabinet. "Violet, would you fetch that roll of linen?" Violet stood, hands trembling slightly, and walked to the cabinet. She turned, holding the bandages out. The man looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes were warm, steady. He did not glance away when it took her a moment to speak. "HHH here." Her lips froze, but he did not flinch. He just smiled, soft and patient, and said, "Take your time." She blinked. Her heart stuttered. He took the roll gently, brushing her fingertips. "Name's Rowan Price," he said. "Work the Walker Ranch across the creek." She nodded, unsure if she could get her name out right now. He waited. Just stood there, holding the linen, not moving, not rushing her. "V. Violet," she whispered. He smiled again. "Nice to meet you, Violet." Over the next few weeks, Violet saw him again. He came by the schoolhouse now and then, sometimes for bandages, sometimes bringing firewood when he rode past, once with a little girl who had scraped her knee. Violet found herself watching for his horse, listening for the creak of saddle leather. He never rushed her, never looked away when she struggled with a word. One afternoon, she stood outside the schoolhouse, sweeping the steps, when his voice came from behind her. "Wanted to ask you something." She turned. Rowan dismounted, tying his horse to the post. "I know the town's been hard on you," he said, voice low, "but I was wondering if you might walk with me, just down the creek and back." Violet hesitated. She glanced toward town, toward the horizon, then back at him. I don't talk much," she said. He stepped closer. "Talk slow, I'll listen all day." A breath caught in her throat. They walked along the creek. He asked nothing that demanded long answers. Just simple things: what flowers she liked, if she had family nearby, whether she had ever ridden a horse on a full moon. She told him, slowly, that she had grown up near here, that her parents had died when she was 16, that people had always made fun of her. He listened. After that, he came by more often. Brought her books, showed her how to mend a saddle strap, taught her how to shoot a rifle once just in case coyotes came close. And then one morning, after the children ran off from school, Violet heard a commotion outside. She stepped onto the porch and saw two boys from town pushing a younger girl, Annie, one of her students, into the dirt. "Say it again, stutter girl," one boy jeered. Annie's face was blotched red. She tried to get up. Violet's voice rang out loud and clear. "Leave her alone," the boys froze. Rowan had come riding up the road. He dismounted fast and quiet and came up behind them. "You heard the lady," he said. "Go on now." The boys scattered. Violet knelt beside Annie, helping her up. The girl clung to her arm. "ISS sound L like you," Annie whispered. Violet nodded, brushing dust off her dress. "And th, that is nothing to be ashamed of." Rowan stood nearby, watching her with something deeper than admiration in his eyes. That night, he brought soup to the schoolhouse. They sat by the fire. He had brought her a book about stars. "I like the way you speak," he said. "Makes a man slow down, pay attention. Feels like every word matters." Her eyes filled. She looked down at her hands, then up at him. "I've never had someone else say that." He reached across, took her hand. "You're strong, Violet. Stronger than half the men I've known." A silence passed between them. It was not empty. She leaned into his shoulder. He did not pull away. And that night, for the first time in her life, Violet Norrin felt like she was not broken. She was just heard and seen, and maybe loved. Light filtered through the warped glass panes of the schoolhouse windows, casting long patterns across the plank floor. A late May sun had finally chased the frost from the earth, and the creek behind the building ran clearer and faster now, its banks newly green. Violet stood barefoot near the water's edge, skirts hiked just above her ankles, easing a splinter from her heel with the tip of a penknife. She'd stepped on a bit of driftwood while chasing after one of the boys who tossed his slate into the current. She frowned down at her foot, fingers steady despite the sting. "Need a hand with that," came Rowan's voice, low and close enough to startle her. She didn't look up immediately, just finished prying the tiny shard loose before wiping her foot on the hem of her petticoat. "I'm fine," she said softly, then added, "B, but thank you." He crouched beside her anyway, not to interfere, just to be near. His hat was pushed back and his forearms were bare, sleeves rolled up past the elbow. He smelled faintly of pine and saddle oil. "You ever think what this place must have looked like before fences and wagons?" he asked, glancing out at the prairie. Violet followed his gaze. "I do. A lot." He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his hand. "I reckon the land remembers." She tucked her foot back into her boot, laced it quickly, and stood. "You speak like a PP poet sometimes." His mouth pulled into a quiet grin. "Only when I'm near you." She rolled her eyes but didn't hide her smile. They walked back toward the schoolhouse together, the hem of her dress brushing his trouser leg now and then. Inside, the desks were still open from the morning's lesson. Rowan ran his fingers along the edge of one of them. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Going somewhere else, starting fresh." She leaned against the doorway. "I did once. Didn't change much. Towns are towns. People follow you," he nodded. "But you stayed. That's not nothing." "I came back," she corrected. "Harder than leaving." He looked at her then, longer than he had before, like he was seeing something new. "I'm looking to buy a stretch of land east of the timberline," he said. "There's a creek and enough grass for 20 head if a man's smart about it." She said nothing at first, only watched the dust dance in the afternoon light. "I'd build a house with a porch," he went on. "Something simple, nothing too grand. Just enough to keep the wind out and the warmth in." "Sounds peaceful," he nodded. "Would be with the right person." She crossed the room and opened the wood stove, feeding kindling into its mouth. The crackle filled the silence between them. "You're not like the men here," she said. I've worked too many places to think I'm better than anyone, he replied. But I know what matters: kindness, patience, a home that don't hurt to be in. She closed the stove and turned to face him. I don't know if I could be a wife. You don't have to be anything but yourself. The weight of that settled over her like a blanket, warm, heavy, grounding. Later that evening, after he'd gone, Violet sat on the back step with a tin cup of chicory. The sky stretched wide above her, streaked with the last pink traces of daylight. She listened to the frogs begin their chorus, the wind slipping through the grass. She didn't know if she loved him yet, but she knew how she felt when he stood beside her. Like the world slowed down just enough for her to catch up. Like she didn't have to defend the way she spoke or how long it took her to finish a sentence. The next day, when the children had gone and the light was low again, he returned. This time he brought her something wrapped in an old cloth napkin. She unfolded it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box carved roughly but with care. The lid bore her initials, burned into the grain. I made it to keep your things in, he said. You can put whatever you want inside. Or nothing at all. She ran her fingers over the letters. He didn't wait for her to speak. Just touched his hat and turned to go. She called after him, voice soft but sure. Rowan. He stopped. I want to see that land. His shoulders eased. He turned back around and this time took a step closer. I'll take you this Sunday, he said. If that's all right, she nodded. Her chest felt tight, but not in the old, painful way. More like something inside was unfolding for the first time. As he rode off, she held the box close. Not for what it was, but for what it meant. Someone had taken the time to make space for her. And that was worth more than any smooth-spoken promise. The ride out to the land took most of Sunday morning. The trail east of the timberline narrowed into a slope of shale and thin pine, where the sun only touched the earth in slivers. Rowan rode ahead, his gelding sure-footed over the uneven path. Violet followed behind on a mare he'd borrowed from a neighbor, her knees aching from the unfamiliar saddle. She didn't complain. When they crested the ridge, the trees gave way to a long meadow, folded between low hills. A stand of cottonwoods flanked the stream, and the smell of damp earth hung in the air. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing through the quiet. Rowan dismounted and waited while she eased herself down carefully, one boot at a time. He led the horses to water, then returned with a bedroll and a sack of cold biscuits. I figured we'd sit a while, he said, spreading the roll beneath one of the trees. Violet tucked her skirt beneath her knees and sat beside him. The grass was soft. The stream hummed. He offered her a biscuit, then leaned back on one elbow. There's a spring up that hill, he said, nodding toward the slope. Flows steady year-round. I checked it last winter before the snow came. She traced a knot in the bark beside her. You've been planning this a while. Since last harvest. I've been saving every cent I didn't need. It's not much land, but it's honest. She looked out across the meadow. You'll need hay cut, fences mended, stock watched. I will, he said, and someone to tell me when I'm being a fool. Her brow rose slightly. He added, I trust you'd be good at that. She laughed, quiet and sudden. It startled a bird from the brush, but Rowan only smiled and sat up straighter, brushing grass from his sleeve. I don't know what I'd be good at, she said. You read faces better than most folks read books, he replied. You see people, that's rare. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers were ink-stained from slates and pages, and her nails were short from nervous chewing. I'll learn to watch. He didn't fill the silence that followed. Instead, he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and laid it between them. I signed the agreement 2 days ago, he said. I'll bring the first payment in next week. She reached for the paper hesitantly, fingertips brushing its edge. I'd like you to see it through with me," he added. "Not just visit, build it." She didn't answer right away. The wind shifted, rustling the grass in long sighs. She studied the creek, where minnows darted in the shallows. "I don't know how to be with someone," she said at last. "You don't have to know now," he said. "Just don't walk away." She folded the paper slowly and handed it back. "I won't." He tucked it away without looking, then sat beside her again, knees brushing. They stayed there through the afternoon, saying little, watching clouds drift over the hills. When it came time to ride back, she mounted without help. That week, Rowan started hauling lumber from a sawmill west of town. Violet helped where she could, drawing rough plans, counting nails, stitching feed sacks into curtains. The children asked where she went on Sundays now. She told them she was helping a friend with a house. One evening, as she swept dust from the schoolhouse floor, a knock came at the side door. Rowan stood there holding a small wooden crate. "These came from Idaho," he said. "Apples. Thought you could use a few." She took the crate and peered inside. "They're very red. Sweet too," he said. "Like you wouldn't expect from the outside." She met his gaze then. "Was that meant to be PP poetry?" "No," he said, "but I'd say it again if it made you smile." She did. That night, after the children had gone and the lamps were trimmed low, they sat by the stove again. He carved a wooden handle for a drawknife while she sewed patches over a student's torn satchel. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" she asked, not looking up. "Didn't think I'd end up anywhere," he said. "I never stayed long in one place." "Why did you stay?" He set the knife aside and turned toward her. "Because I saw something worth staying for." She didn't speak, just reached across and laid her hand over his, and this time he didn't let go. The house rose slowly, week by week, ribbed with raw timber and the smell of fresh sawdust. Violet stood at the edge of the clearing one morning, watching Rowan hammer a rafter into place. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his movements were precise, practiced. She didn't interrupt. She liked to see how he moved when he didn't think anyone was watching. A pair of barn swallows swooped overhead, looping through the blue. She shaded her eyes and followed them until they disappeared beyond the tree line. "Roof'll be on by Sunday," Rowan said, not looking down. "You'll be warm before the first frost." She stepped closer and set down the basket she'd carried from town, salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, a jar of beans she'd boiled the night before, and a small parcel of tobacco leaves for his pipe, which he hadn't asked for but she knew he liked. "I brought lunch." He climbed down and wiped his hands on his trousers before reaching for the basket. "Wasn't expecting all this," he said. "You spoil me." She sat on the stump nearest the creek and opened the cloth. "I don't know if it's spoiling or just care." He lowered himself beside her and pulled free a biscuit half the size of his palm. "Either way, I'll take it." They ate without hurry, the creek whispering alongside them. She passed him the jar and he drank straight from it before wiping the rim and handing it back. "I had a letter," she said after a while, "from my cousin in Topeka. She's marrying a man from Missouri. Wants me there come July." He chewed slowly, then set the biscuit down. "You thinking of going?" She says I could stay. "That there's work in the schoolhouse there." His jaw shifted, but he didn't speak right away. "I told her no," she added. "Why?" She folded the cloth over the leftover food. "Because I belong here now. And because you didn't ask me to stay, you just made room." Rowan looked at her then, really looked, the way he did only when he was sorting through something he couldn't quite name. "I didn't want to make you feel beholden." "You didn't," she said. "You made me feel wanted." He reached for her hand where it rested on her lap. His fingers were rough with splinters and stained with pitch, but his touch was gentle. "I want you here every day," he said. "Not just on Sundays." She met his eyes. "Then ask me." "Will you build a life with me, Violet?" She answered with a nod, then whispered, "Yes," without hesitation. That night she didn't return to the schoolhouse. They stayed by the fire he built inside the unfinished frame of the house, the stars wide above them through the open rafters. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and they sat close, knees touching, her head resting lightly against his side. "I used to think I'd always be alone," she said. "That no one would want to wait for me to find my words. You waited for yourself," he said. "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." And when he kissed her, it was slow and steady, like everything else between them, without rush, without demand, just the quiet promise of a man who listened and a woman who had finally been heard. In the morning, the first nail of the bedroom wall went in beneath her hand. One hammer strike at a time, they built it together. By early October, the trees along the creek had turned gold and rust, their leaves bowing low with the weight of the season's end. The roof was on. The walls were chinked and sturdy. Smoke curled from the stovepipe for the first time, and the scent of fresh-hewn pine still clung to the frame of the house. Violet stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flour, listening to the rhythmic clatter of Rowan splitting wood just beyond the porch. Inside, the home they'd built together had begun to take root with small, quiet details: a rag rug she'd woven from torn dresses, a shelf where he'd placed her reading book beside his pocket Bible, a narrow table he'd carved from leftover cedar. Nothing grand, but everything held meaning. She turned toward the hearth, kneeling down to adjust the damper. A kettle of beans simmered gently, and the bread she'd set to rise that morning had already taken shape in the pan. She reached for Rowan's coat hanging on the peg and folded it over her arm. The sleeves were still damp from the morning's snow flurry. Rowan stepped in a few moments later, shoulders dusted with bark, the axe carried loose in one hand. He leaned it against the doorframe and brushed his palms on his trousers. "You'll want to come outside," he said, voice low with a hint of something unreadable. She followed him to the edge of the clearing, where the last of the sun turned the grass to copper. A small calf, barely steady on its legs, stood beside a nervous heifer just beyond the fence they'd strung together in August. "She calved early," Rowan said. "Didn't expect it till frost was deeper in the ground." Violet stepped closer, fingers curling around one of the fence rails. "Will it live, if we're steady with it? Keep it warm fed." He glanced her way. "It'll make it." They stood there a while, watching the calf nuzzle against its mother. A breeze stirred the hem of her dress, and she shifted closer to him without thinking. His hand found hers, and they stood in silence until the moon rose soft and pale over the far ridge. Later, after supper, they sat across from one another at the table. Rowan reached into the drawer and pulled out a folded paper, a deed, signed and witnessed, marked with the seal of the county office. "Made it official today," he said, sliding it across the table. She opened it slowly, her eyes following the lines of ink. Her name was there, written beside his. "Not as a visitor or a helper, but as co-holder of the land. I wanted it to be ours," he said. "Not just mine with you in it." She pressed her palm flat against the paper, then looked up at him. "I didn't think I'd ever belong to anything." "You don't belong to anything," he said. "You belong with me." She stood then, walked around the table and rested her forehead against his. He wrapped his arms around her waist, anchoring her in the stillness of that moment. That winter, she left the schoolhouse for good. One of the older girls from a nearby homestead took over the younger class, and Violet packed her few belongings into a single trunk. Rowan met her at the door without a word, lifting the trunk onto the wagon and offering his hand to help her up. They passed the months with quiet rituals: mornings spent tending the stove and checking the calf's growth, afternoons repairing harness straps or stitching worn gloves by the fire, evenings reading aloud in turns, her voice slow and steady, his deep and patient. One morning in March, Violet woke with the scent of thaw in the air and Rowan's arm warm across her waist. She turned slightly, watching the light creep across the wall. "I want to marry you," she said. He didn't open his eyes right away. Just pulled her closer and said, "Then let's do it." They stood beneath the cottonwoods 4 weeks later, with the creek running full beside them and a neighbor's wife holding the book open to the right page. Violet wore a dress she'd sewn from unbleached muslin, and Rowan had shaved for the first time in a month. There were no rings, but he placed his hand over hers and promised her everything he could offer: his steadiness, his strength, his name. She promised him her truth, her voice, and her whole, quiet heart. They built a garden that spring, planted potatoes and beans, lined the rows with ash and pine needles. The calf grew strong and another followed before summer's end. The porch filled with the scent of drying herbs, and the house echoed with the sounds of laughter, low, shared, real. Years passed, and the land held them like a cradle. They lived through lean seasons and full harvests. They never raised their voices at each other, not once. When words felt too heavy, they held hands instead. When storms rolled in, they sat close and listened for the wind to pass. And through all of it, through every hard hour and gentle one, Rowan never asked her to be anything she wasn't. Violet never tried to be anyone else. They grew their life together, not loud or fast, but sure and steady, and they were happy. Fully, deeply, quietly happy, because they had built something that lasted, because they had chosen each other every day in the small and sacred ways that mattered most. Because love, when true, does not need to shout to be heard.